What's up guys, so today we have a video about the Switch V1 console. The Switch V1 has a few differences compared to the V2 console, which we'll go over in this video. The installation process of the Picofly chip is largely similar, but there are a couple differences you need to be aware of. The first thing to be aware of is that some V1s are patched and some V1s are unpatched. When they first started manufacturing these consoles, there was a way to force it to go into RCM mode or recovery mode, and in this mode the console was susceptible to injecting a payload. In our case, Hecate, which allows us to read and write to and from the internal NAND. But they fixed this in later versions of the V1 console and then completely fixed it in all of the V2 consoles. But what this means is that some versions of the V1 console do not need a chip installed. There's a couple ways to tell whether or not the console is a V1. The main way is if you look at the serial number. The V1s generally will start with XAW100, and that's a good indication that it's a V1 console. The other indication is the model number right here. It says HAC001. If there's no parentheses after the model number like this, that usually means that this console is a V1 console. That's not always the case. I think I've seen some with the parentheses that are still a V1. I think the serial number is a bit of a better indication. So even though you don't necessarily need to install the chip into the console, when you have a V1, we're going to install a chip anyways. So with all the screws out, we're going to pull up on the metal backing here. And the first thing we need to do before we do anything else is unplug the battery. So I just like to take the point of the plastic spudger here and just shove it under the battery connector and pull up. And then we're just going to bend it out of the way and the console is safe to work on. And I'm just going to scrape off this stuff here and I'm going to use alcohol. I never recommend cleaning right away with alcohol. You should scrape up as much thermal paste as you can before using alcohol, because otherwise it will just sort of spread it around. And then I like to use some alcohol on these foam pads here. Just be generous, and we'll let that work on the adhesive while we unscrew the heatsink. And you're going to get under the heatsink with your nail to just separate the thermal paste, and don't just pull up on this because you will bend this here. Instead, we're going to come in here and pull up gently on the foam. You can't always get this off nicely, but I like to try just like this. So this is ready to take out now, but I recommend pulling up from this corner here so you're not putting undue stress on the heatsink, because this is very soft and it can bend very easily. And again, we're just going to clean the thermal paste without alcohol first, and then we can use some alcohol to get the rest off. And try not to scrape up this copper shielding on the APU. It will damage the cooling capability of the heatsink. Alright, so the next step is going to be to come in with the microscope. And we need to take off this APU shield here. So to do this without damaging the shield, don't just tear up on this. You will tear this thing apart. Get a needle, like a sewing needle like this, and just get in the corner right here of the shielding on the lock and pull it out just so it clears the bump right here. And then that's plenty, and we're just going to move on to the next one. Perfect, moving on. And take your time with this. You can see there's a ton of small traces underneath and around the APU, and you really don't want to be tearing through those. So don't put any downward pressure on the needle. Just put it in the corner and pry out. And it really doesn't take that long. You're gonna spend a lot more time trying to pry this thing off if you don't do this, and likely cause tons of damage to the shield and potentially knock off components. And get under the corners of the APU shield and just pull up. And then you should be able to just peel off the thermal paste. And wow, that actually is not nearly enough thermal paste. See, that's not even covering like a third of the die surface area. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and clean up the shield. Just take a Q-tip like this. It's hard to clean this copper area without alcohol, and then you could take a dry Q-tip and soak it up, and then you have a nice clean shield like this. And before we put this aside, I'm going to take the back of my brush here or some other round tool and just push in the locks again so that they will clip on when we put this back on. Alright, and then for cleaning the APU, we'll just take a dry Q-tip and go around in between the caps. In this case, there's really not a lot to clean. Most of the time there's going to be quite a bit of thermal paste in here. Just pick up what you can, and then grab a brush like this with some alcohol and do circular motions on top of the caps, and that will clean out in between the caps. And then you can use a Kim wipe like this to just soak up the alcohol that mixed with the thermal paste. So the APU is nice and clean, which is good because we need to solder to it. The next step is going to be to pull off this NAND chip right here. the eMMC chip is plugged into the board in this case, and we can actually remove it from the board, which is super nice. Now this thing has a bunch of glue underneath it, and you don't want to be flexing this PCB. This is a BGA chip, and you can very easily break solder balls underneath the NAND. So we want to be pretty gentle with this thing. So what I like to do is grab a BGA tool like this, which has these thin flexible things, and I take the round attachment and just put a ton of alcohol on it like this, 99% isopropyl, and you're just going to try to slide it in between this shielding and the NAND. Careful not to go too far to the right here because there are caps and components on this side. Just go underneath the NAND where it's touching the shield and slowly wiggle it underneath the NAND. And don't put too much pressure, just soak it with some more rubbing alcohol and go back underneath. And one more time, and we should be through to the other side. And once you're here, you just want to push it this way a little bit, sort of back and forth, very slowly, and that will separate the glue from the eMMC. There is still some sort of metal adhesive underneath this side to ground the eMMC to the shield, but it's easy enough to pull up with your fingers at this point. So just equally pull up on this connector here and the NAND, and you should be able to pretty easily pull it up like this. And you can see there's that little metal adhesive which connects to this big ground pad on the eMMC. So that's the safest way to take this thing out without bending or flexing this PCB, which you definitely don't want to do. So we're going to put this aside for now. This is also paired to the board, so do not lose this or do not get it mixed up with another console, because this is unique to this console. And without this, the console is basically a donor board. So this is the one you want with the flex cable like this. It's usually called Picofly Core, and it has this connection for the eMMC on the chip. And the reason you want this one is it's significantly easier to install than the other version, which looks like this and doesn't have that sort of flex cable. You can still install this chip in here, but you need to manually run some wires, or they make an FPC that allows you to solder the points you need on the back of this eMMC connector. And that looks like this here. It's just this little FPC connector that sits on the back of here, and you solder it to certain points. So you can use this along with this chip and you'll be good to go. And as always, you can solder up the points manually if you need to. But I definitely recommend grabbing this version because it's so much easier to install in this version of the console. So let's get under the microscope here, and we need to install the APU flex cable. There are two different versions of the APU flex cable for the V1 and the V2 consoles. The V1 console has these pads on the top and bottom of the caps like this. And the other indication that it's the V1 is this diagonal capacitor on the top left of the APU. If you compare this to the V2 APU, there is no diagonal capacitor on the top left, and the bottom capacitors have some that are horizontal. So for this one, you need the V2 flex cable, which has pads on the left and right of those caps, just like this. The V1 flex cable also only has one MOSFET on the back of it, while the V2 has two MOSFETs on the back of it, because there's different needs for different consoles. So definitely make sure you have the right flex cable here. For the V2 console specifically, without that diagonal capacitor, you can use this other flex cable for the OLED. This one that we install in the Lite console and in the OLED console. This will work on the V2 because it has those two MOSFETs, and it will fit the caps on the board like this. The only reason you would need to install this version is if you were installing this version of the Picofly without the flex cable. But keep in mind, you can only use this on the V2. For the V1, you need the V1 flex cable like this for the APU. That being said, you still can use this OLED Picofly in a V1. What you have to do is you have to take the V1 flex cable and solder a wire to the center two pads of this flex cable here. And once you solder the cable to the center pad of the flex cable, you will solder that to the CPU point on the bottom right of the Picofly. That right there next to the CPU connector. Instead of plugging something into this connector, you just solder that one wire to there. And this will work in a V1 if you do it that way. Okay, so I don't actually recommend tinning these before you put them on the console. A lot of people like to tin these before putting them on. I don't particularly like doing that because the cutouts for the caps here can sometimes be a bit too small. Sometimes you need to kind of like bend these around the caps. Actually, in this case, you can see they're a little too small. So we do need to kind of bend each side so that the flex cable can sit flat on the board like that. If you tin this before you put it on, you won't have nearly as much flexibility on these pads to bend them around the caps. So that's why I don't tin it before I put it on. And it's plenty easy to solder these to the caps without tinning it first. Doesn't really provide that much of a benefit, to be honest. And then I'm going to set my iron to 375 and tin both sides of the knife tip that I use like this. And I'm going to press down on the flex cable with tweezers while I solder both sides of the connector. And you want to be heating the cap and the pad at the same time so that solder actually adheres to the top of the cap. So you can see right there, that's a good joint right there. That's also looking good. And same deal with this side. That's a good joint. Very good. So you can see solder is fully touching both sides of the capacitor. That is good stuff. All right, next I'm going to boost my iron to 425 and we're going to heat both the pad here and the shield. If you don't heat both, solder won't properly adhere to the shield. That's good. And you don't want too much solder here. You just want just enough. That's perfect. And the main points you need on this particular flex is the top 2 points here and at least one ground connection. So these are the actual 2 points at the top. The bottom of these two caps is ground, and then obviously these are ground as well. So at least one ground connection, and these top 2 points need to be soldered properly for this flex cable to work. If we check out resistance mode, we have ground here and the point here, and we should be getting something like that, 26 ohms. This is going to be pretty low resistance here, 27 ohms. And then between these 2 points, they should be connected. So we should have close to 0 ohms. There we go. And then obviously these two as well are ground, so they are connected as well. So that is a perfectly installed APU connector. And we're just going to take 160-ish degree hot air and warm up the flux to make it a lot easier to clean. And then we can use a Kim wipe to soak up the flux and incorporate some IPA. You'll have to do a few passes with heat. Another thing I like to do is take a Q-tip with IPA on it and apply heat while rolling it back and forth on the flex cable. This sort of pushes out excess flux that's stuck underneath the flex cable and allows you to better clean it up. There we go. So this is looking great to me. Next thing we're going to want to do is put some Kapton tape over these points, because we don't want them shorting to the shield above it. So I'm going to grab some Kapton tape right here, and I'll take my ceramic scissors, cut a piece that's about this big, and then we're going to cut this lengthwise so it's a good size to fit over those caps. And I like to line up the straight part of the Kapton tape with the bottom of the die, just like this, and we'll get this pushed down. That is perfect. So next what we're going to do is we're going to take the chip here, and we have this little connector here that we need to plug into this. This is a lot easier to do before you put the shield back on. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up on this flex cable, and we're going to plug it in and then lock down the connector just like that. So this is good. And then you can go ahead and line up the EMC connector just like this and just gently push down, and it should snap in with no problems. If you have any resistance, make sure you're lining it up correctly and then pop it in. Trust me, you don't want to be damaging that connector. All right, so next what we want to do is we're going to modify the APU shield. So this is going to sit just like this, but we want to make sure we bend this lock up here and it will line up perfectly with that flex cable, because we don't want to put any pressure or cut through this flex cable when we put the APU shield back on. So we need to bend in this lock right here on the top. So I like to use needle nose pliers for this, and we're just going to come in here and bend this lock flat. Just like that. That's perfect. You can see there's a little window there now, and this will line up perfectly with the FPC there. The other thing that can get in the way sometimes are these speaker wires, and I like to just bend these with my finger like this, just so they don't get in the way of the APU shield. Perfect. So now we're going to take some thermal paste. I use Arctic MX4. Grab this stuff from Amazon. Don't order this stuff on AliExpress. You'll get fake stuff and it will not cool nearly as well. And we'll put enough of this to actually cover the APU, unlike them. And we're going to put this directly over the thermal paste. Apply pressure with your thumb to spread out the thermal paste. And then you can start clipping in these locks that we bent back. And that's perfect, just like that. Next, what we want to do is grab some double-sided tape. I like to take 4 layers of it like this, and then just stack them up on top of each other, and I'll use the ceramic scissors to sort of cut this down to size. And we're going to want to apply this to the back of the eMMC just like this. So this will provide both insulation and enough thickness to adhere to the rest of the chip. And we're just going to plug this in this direction like this to the chip, just like that. Click it in and then put a little bit of pressure there to make sure it adheres. And then we're going to again apply another 4 layers of tape between the eMMC and the shielding here. Same thing. 1 or 2 layers is generally not enough to provide enough adhesion. So this is looking good. Because it's facing downwards, we don't have to worry too much about insulating it. But I do still like to take a nice long piece of Kapton tape like this and just tape this thing down to the board just so it doesn't go anywhere. Careful not to overlap tape too much with this copper area too much over here so it doesn't interfere with where the heatsink is going to go. All right, and now we can test. So we're just going to plug the battery in here and I'm going to press the power button. We should see 1 flash of white light and then a flashing blue light and then finally a single flash of white light to indicate that it successfully glitched the console. So I'm going to press power. You can see we're getting a white light there, flashing blue light, and then actually it'll be a green light, I believe. Just give it some time. Sometimes it takes longer than others. And there we go. You can see it's trying to boot from the payload on the SD card, but we don't have an SD card in there, so we just get the no SD card screen. The more you boot the console, the more the chip will learn this particular console and the faster it will glitch. The other thing we want to do here before we finish up is press both the volume up and volume down buttons to make sure that it still boots into the official firmware. Cool, so I'm going to turn off the console. This is good to go. And something to note is that when you turn the console off from the official firmware, if you wait long enough, you'll see this is going to flash again because it'll provide the 3.3 volts to the console for whatever reason a little bit later on. So you can see it's just turning on again here. I don't know why it necessarily does that. It only does that when you turn off the console from the official firmware. So we can unplug the battery here and get the console reassembled. So again, we're going to put some thermal paste, enough to cover this rectangular area here. And you're going to insert the heatsink top first in here, and you got to clip it in to these little areas here. And then you can push down on the heatsink itself to spread out that thermal paste, line it up with the holes, and then we can get this thing screwed down. I like to screw in 1 screw at a time, a tiny bit, not all the way first, so that all 3 of them line up the heatsink perfectly, and then we can bottom out all 3 screws. Next thing we need to do is modify the shield because this is not going to fit with the chip in here. So if we line this up, we can see we need to cut right about here and here. So grab yourself a heavy duty pair of scissors or tin snips, and we need to cut right up next to this screw hole here. So just like this all the way through, and then same on just on the left side of this bend, just like that. And that's a perfect amount of space here for the chip. But make sure after you cut this, you're gonna have some bent up metal like this, and you just want to make sure to bend it down and bend everything back into place so that the shield is nicely lined up when we put it back in the console. If you don't bend these back, the plastic backing of the console won't always sit flat and it will be pretty annoying. Then we just need to apply the final layer of thermal paste to the top of the heatsink there. We can plug in the console battery. Make sure that this little thermal pad here is still above the charger chip. That thing gets warm, and then we can line this up. I like to line it up using this middle screw hole here, and you can press down on that thermal paste. Then we can just go ahead and screw the back on the console. All right, so I like to use a plastic spudger like this and line up this SD card connector just like this. And make sure you line up the little alignment hole here on both this side and this side, and you can screw it down. And then finally, I like to just make sure this has a good connection after having screwed it down. And then we can put this foam thing in place right above the connector like that. Perfect. And the back cover is ready to go back on this thing. When you put the back cover back on, just make sure to snap in the top first, and then the rest of it will go on nicely. When you're screwing back in these smaller screws on the top and the bottom, just be very careful because they're screwing into plastic on this particular console model, and it's very easy to break the plastic, especially on a well-used console, just enough to hold the cover in place like this. So we're going to go to Aesthetic's site. He does a great job of compiling all of the most useful tools and things into one package. So we're just going to go into NC under NHS, hats, and releases. And here's the most recent one. You can see the firmware that it supports here, and we're going to scroll down to download. So here's the hats pack we just downloaded, and you're just going to drag all of these files over to the root of the SD card. And we can put the SD card back in the console here. I'll boot the console, and you can see that time it went really fast. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to Tools. We're going to go to Partition SD card. Okay. And we're going to drag the MUMMC slider up until it says 29 full. The V1, V2, and Lite consoles all have a 32 gig NAND chip, and the OLED console has a 64 gig NAND chip. So the software on the OLED is about 60 gigs instead of 30 like this. So then we'll say next step. We're going to say start, and I'll press power to format and partition the SD. Note that it's using FAT32. It is most stable when you use FAT32 for this. Don't recommend using exFAT. All right, and the next thing I do after partitioning the SD is we're gonna go into payloads here, use lockpick RCM to dump the console keys. So we're just going to press power to dump from system NAND. You can use the volume button to navigate here. All right, and then it dumps them to the switch folder here and prod.keys, which is what we want. And we're gonna press power to go back, and we're gonna go down to reboot to Hiccup. All right, and before we do anything else, we want to go to Tools, Backup eMMC, and back up both the boot 0 and boot 1, and then the raw GPP partitions of the NAND. This one will go pretty fast. This one is going to take about 20-ish minutes to back up. So I like to just make sure we charge the console while backing this up. You can see it's red here because it's using the battery, but if we plug it in, we should start to see it turn green, which indicates that it is charging the battery more than it is using. So that's good. We're gonna leave this for about 20 minutes and come back when it's done. While we're waiting for this, I like to keep these bags, and what I do is I label them and put the extra flex cables back in here. So because we didn't use the V2 flex cable here, I'm just gonna find my V2 Core CPU flex bag and pop the extra in here. It is really nice to have extras of these because when you buy the chips, they don't always come with the flex cables you need, depending on the version of the chip you get. And you can sometimes get a pretty decent discount per chip if you don't need the flex cables. So I have a ton of these, and I can basically buy whichever chips I want from AliExpress because I know I have all of the flex cables I need. All right, so once it's done backing up, there'll be a bunch of parts of the backup in a folder on the SD because it's FAT32 formatted, and there's a max file size for FAT32. So it splits it up into little chunks, and you can combine them on the computer if you ever need to. You can also move all those parts into the restore folder and click this restore eMMC button in order to restore the backup if you ever need to do that. You also have console info here, which gives you info about the micro SD card. If you ever see a fake ID here instead of an actual vendor ID, you just want to make sure you immediately turn the console off and use a genuine SD card because you can damage your console, because those fake ones generally don't store as much data as they say they will, and they overwrite data on them as you reach that limit, which can cause big issues when you are booting from the SD card. You also have eMMC info here. You can see the speed that the NAND is running at and some of the partitions. You want to make sure it's running at 400 megabytes per second. If it's 200 or slower, then something is wrong with your installation or your NAND is failing. We can also see battery info here, which is pretty helpful, and then hardware and fuse info from here. And you can see this can detect that it is exploitable to the recovery mode bug, but because we have the chip installed, we don't need to use that bug. Now we want to create a copy of the NAND on the SD card partition that we created, so we can go to MUMMC here and create MUMMC. We're going to select SD partition and partition 1. And this will clone the internal NAND to that partition of the SD card so that the console can boot from the SD card. So we'll wait for this to finish and come back. All right, so now that this is finished, we have the capability of booting into the clone of the NAND using this option here, which will boot with custom firmware. This option boots into the internal NAND using the official firmware, but it does skip fuse count checks, so this can be useful. These also skip fuse count checks, and this boots into the internal NAND with custom firmware. So yeah, that's the gist of the installation on the V1 and the V2. Both are largely similar installs outside of that CPU flex cable difference. And if you want to figure out if your V1 switch is patched, you can go to ismyswitchpatch.com and you can select a prefix for your serial number and type in the next few numbers of the serial. So in this case, 003. And in this case, we can see that the console is not patched. As it says here, if you don't see a prefix here that matches your console serial number, it means that it's almost definitely a patched console. And sometimes this will say that it's not sure if it's patched. So the only way to really find out in that case is to try to inject a payload. So there's a couple different ways you can do that, but one of the more popular ways is to get a RCM loader like this, which is a little rechargeable payload injector. And it comes with this nice little jig in here that allows you to short those pads on the Joy-Con rail safely in order to get the console to boot into recovery mode. So I'll show you how this works. So with the console completely shut off and the screen facing you, you take this jig on the right Joy-Con rail here, not on the left one, on the right one, and slide it down with the pins facing downwards like this until it just sort of clicks into place. And then you're going to hold volume up on the console and press the power button. And what you should get is absolutely nothing on the screen, just like this. And in this state, you would normally use the RCM loader and plug it in, and it will inject a payload for you. But I'm going to show you how to do it on the computer. So we're going to plug in the switch now that it's in recovery mode to the computer with USB cable. And then on the computer, we're just going to go into Device Manager, and we should see the device show up as APX, just like this, under Other Devices. From here, we're going to install this tool, which will allow us to install the correct drivers. So we're just going to say download here. So we've got it opened up here. Right away, we see APX showing in the drop down here. You're going to want to make sure that's selected. If you don't see APX show up here, just go to options and say list all devices. Now we're going to want to switch the driver to libusbk, just like this. And now we'll click install driver. And now it's going to install the correct driver for us. So we'll just give it a moment. All right, we can see the driver was successfully installed. So now we should see this show up under libusbk USB devices. And then we're going to go to Tegra RCM GUI, and we're going to grab the MSI installer for Windows. So once you open Tegra RCM GUI and you have the switch plugged in via USB-C, and you have those drivers installed, you should see this show up as green. And here's where we're going to attempt to inject a payload to the switch. So I'm going to double click on this Hecate payload here. So I'll double click, and it's going to attempt to inject a payload. You can see it did succeed in this case, but because we don't have the SD card inside with Hecate on it, I won't be able to boot into Hecate, but you can see it did work to inject a payload. And you can see also on the screen, it says payload successfully injected with the green check mark. This confirms that this device is unpatched. So I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.